Hi, my name's Carlos Sanchez, and this is my project for the Fall 2020 Justice Theme Semester, and it's entitled The Relevance and Fairness of the Electoral College in the Modern Age. So first, let's start off with just a little overview of how the Electoral College actually works. So the Electoral College is essentially just a system that we have in place in the United States for electing the president. So there are a total of 538 electors, and each state has a number of electors equal to its members in Congress, that is, both the House and the Senate, and there's also an additional 3 for Washington, D.C. So the electors for each state can be anyone and are chosen by their respective party's leadership, and that's whatever party wins in the popular vote of that state for their presidential election. So by doing that, voters are not directly voting for a presidential candidate, but rather they're voting for their state's electors to vote on their behalf. So a candidate only needs a simple majority of electors, that's 270 or more electors to win. And most states follow a winner-take-all system, where whoever wins the popular vote of that state receives all of that state's electors. What I say most because Maine and Nebraska actually have a slightly different system that we'll touch on a little bit later. There's also the chance for a faithless elector, which is essentially just an elector that votes differently than they're supposed to, doesn't coincide with their state. So there are a lot of pros and cons that are discussed when talking about the Electoral College. The biggest perceived pro that I've seen is that it gives states it gives smaller states a bit more representation relative to that of bigger states. So people really like that because it keeps the interests of small states from being kind of drowned out by that of big states, and it really lets them have a voice in national politics a little bit more. And ironically, that pro is also its biggest con, because mathematically, this way, one person's vote from one state is not going to have the same weight as that of someone from another state. Additionally, it's possible for someone to win the popular vote but lose in the Electoral College. And with the winner-take-all system, the votes of the minority in the state are essentially worthless. So there's a lot of history that goes behind the Electoral College. We can start by looking at the Constitutional Convention where it was conceived, and as can be seen in this picture. And in this Constitutional Convention, a lot was discussed, including Alexander Hamilton, his views on democracy and representation. So Hamilton essentially believed, as you can see from this quote, that people really were not that capable. The common man was not capable of electing a president because they lacked the political education and the means of gaining that political education. So instead, it was best to rely on people that were educated and more wealthy to actually make that decision. So, in the Constitutional Convention, there were a lot of plans and an eventual compromise that was reached, and these plans are more so pertaining to representation in Congress, but that actually goes and kind of bleeds into the Electoral College a bit because of the Electoral College functioning as a body that has the same number as members of Congress. So the first plan was the Virginia plan, and it proposed population-weighted representation for states, and the other was the New Jersey plan, which proposed equal representation for states. So eventually they came up with the Great Compromise, which creates a bicameral legislature that we have today, and the concept of equal representation is carried on in the Senate, and the population-weighted representation is carried on in the House. So this carries over to the Electoral College, as even the smallest state will have at least 3 electors. So ultimately, the Electoral College was outlined in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, and note that it says that one elector should not represent more than 30,000 people. I'll touch back on this later, but this is very important to consider as it's not at all true today. So, personally, I believe that the Electoral College is no longer as relevant and necessary in modern American politics as it was when it was first established. And I believe that there is a lot of evidence that would suggest that we can do better than the Electoral College. So, are Hamilton's ideas still relevant today? Not at all. So, Hamilton thought that the common man could not be politically educated enough to possibly make a good decision as to who should lead the country. But with how popular and how accessible social media, smartphones, 24-hour news cycle, all types of media, and just access to information, the common people have never had more access to political information in their lives, and I don't think that the founding fathers like Hamilton could have ever envisioned just how popular and how accessible knowledge would be. So, as I also mentioned earlier, the popular vote doesn't always coincide with the Electoral College. So these are two different maps showing the results of the 2016 election, in which Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College, but Hillary Clinton actually beat Donald Trump in the popular vote. So the map on the left kind of shows a map that would definitely lead most people to believe that Donald Trump won. It shows the results by precinct so there's a lot more red on that map. But on the right, we have a slightly different map, which kind of factors in the population densities of each of the voting precincts. And there's a lot more blue on this map, and it's a lot more representative of the popular vote. And what we can see is that a lot of the Democrat votes are concentrated in cities, and that actually led to a majority in the popular vote. So there's also an unintended focus on swing states. One of the ideas behind creating the Electoral College was that presidential candidates wouldn't just spend their time campaigning to the big states. They wouldn't put all their focus into the big states. And while this is true, they certainly don't put all their focus into the big states. Instead, they only put their focus into a lot of the smaller swing states, which are essentially just states that could go either way, could vote for one candidate or another. So by doing this, they're kind of neglecting a lot of voters in the country by just focusing on 6 or 7 states. So say a big state like New York or a big state like Texas, those are considered to kind of be locked in for one candidate or another. But a slightly smaller state like Arizona, that is going to have a lot more funding towards campaign ads and actual focus in the Electoral College so that the candidate might win the Electoral College. So what do we actually value? When we're talking about all this, a lot of the time we talk about big state versus small state interests and urban versus rural interests. But I think something that's really important to remember is who the actual voters are. Is it the states or the people? So with the Electoral College, it definitely seems to be more of the states, not so much the people. But what matters shouldn't really be geographical boundaries in my mind, but rather lifestyle. And the rural lifestyle that is normally associated with conservative voters, and that is kind of the aim to protect in the Electoral College, that is not so much only in small states. Rural voters exist in pretty much every country or in every state, and by having the Electoral College, we're kind of neglecting those voters in the big states and the small states as well, as essentially a lot of the votes are just kind of tossed out. So I think that we are now technologically and socially capable of valuing individuals over states. So this is just an example of those votes kind of just being thrown away in a state that a lot of the time it can be a close race, So this is Georgia in the 2020 election, which was Joe Biden versus Donald Trump primarily. So Joe Biden won by just about 13,000 votes, or 0.2% of the popular vote in Georgia. That means that 49.3% of the vote, essentially half of the vote, was just tossed out. So even though Donald Trump received a lot of the votes in that state, his votes are not going to be represented in the Electoral College. And Joe Biden actually did win the popular vote in this election as well, but there were other similar states where Trump won that Joe Biden's votes were also thrown out. So, what can we do instead of the Electoral College? First, one thing is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And what this proposes is essentially that states agree to let their electoral votes coincide with the popular vote of the nation. So this is good because no amendment would be needed, and the Electoral College would be always coinciding with the popular vote. But the downside to this is that not enough states have joined it yet to reach 270, which is the majority needed to actually win. And states that have joined are historically Democrat, not Republican. And we need a little more bipartisanship to actually reach that 270. So, another argument that could be made is to have just more electors. And like I mentioned earlier, the Constitution originally said that there should be no more than 30,000 people per elector. But this isn't followed today at all, with each elector a lot of the time representing hundreds of thousands of people. So going back to this would be a lot more representative of the popular vote, but at that point, you're going to need thousands of electors, and why not just use the popular vote then? So something else we could do is split the electoral votes like they do in Nebraska and Maine. So instead of winner take all, electoral votes are allowed to be split if different districts vote differently. So this is a lot more representative of actual votes in states geographically, but I don't see this being a real possibility, as winner take all is often in the interest of both parties, particularly Democrats, as a lot of their votes are concentrated in cities, as we saw earlier, and those cities only make up a few electoral districts. So that would mean that they would only win a few districts instead of winning the entire state. So then we come to the popular vote, which just at a glance is by far the most simple solution, the most simple alternative to the Electoral College. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So with the popular vote, one person would equal one vote, regardless of what state you're in. So it could also arguably benefit both parties, as votes aren't thrown away on either side. And that way, the voice of a Republican is heard the same as the voice of a Democrat, which could also contribute to less partisanship, as you could also have more third-party candidates that might be able to actually have a bit of a chance in the election. So the cons is that it requires an amendment, and it's kind of difficult to convince people to change, especially when the Electoral College historically kind of favors Republicans, as we saw with the 2016 election and a few other elections. So close votes could also be contested, which is a little dangerous because it could lead to a lot of recounts and confusions and legal battles. But I think there are ways to address these issues. So first of all, obviously, it's a plurality. And we could also have requirements for candidates to be on the ballot at all. So certain funding requirements or support requirements needed to actually be on the ballot. And if the vote is too close, then we could allow the House to decide, as we often do, as is proposed in the Constitution, really, if there's a tie in the Electoral College, the House decides. So if the vote is close with a popular vote, the House could also decide. So overall, that's my opinion on the Electoral College and the relevance and fairness of it now in our modern age with technology and social media. So overall, I really do believe that we as a nation can do better than the Electoral College. And yeah, I appreciate you listening to this, and thank you for listening to my presentation. Have a good day.